This review video is going to be about the USVA history curriculum for the state of Virginia, dealing with Standard 9, which in particular deals with the United States' imperialism as well as role in World War I. Alright, so what are we going to be looking at? For starters, the student will demonstrate knowledge of the emerging role of the United States in world affairs by explaining the changing policies of the United States toward Latin America and Asia and the growing influence of the United States in foreign markets, and evaluating the United States' involvement in World War I, including Wilson's 14 points, the Treaty of Versailles, and the national debate over treaty ratification and the League of Nations. The essential understandings that you should walk away with after this will be that many 20th century American foreign policy issues have their origins in America's emergence as a world power at the end of the 19th century. America's intervention in World War I ensured her role as a world power for the remainder of the century. The growing role of the United States in international trade displayed the American urge to build, innovate, and explore new markets. Additionally, while American entry into World War I ensured Allied victory, the failure to conclude a lasting peace left a bitter legacy. The essential questions that the state of Virginia wants you to kind of think about while you're going through this are, why did the United States abandon her traditional isolationist foreign policy? How did the United States expand her influence in the world? Why did the United States become involved in World War I? And lastly, how did visions of the post-war world differ? Okay, so hopefully you remember from your World II class that the European nations had really seized control of most of Africa and southern Asia. And really, when the United States is looking on to this from afar, they are really going to be influenced by it, right? Because they can't really ignore the benefits of this. And as one of the main reasons for imperialism, the raw materials that are going to be received from these conquered areas, they're going to be brought back for manufactured goods. And when they bring those raw materials back and then they create manufactured goods with them, they are also looking to expand the markets in these conquered areas. So basically they're going to take the raw materials, then they're going to bring them back to the home country, manufacture things with this new industrial machine and industrial revolution that we've previously talked about, and then they are going to then bring those things back and sell them in those conquered areas, right? So another really important thing to kind of just understand is that racism is going to be another thing that's really going to help shape the imperialistic mindset of this time period, right? Many of the Western cultures, in particular, the whites, are going to really feel that it's their duty to spread their religion and their culture to these areas that they don't view as civilized, right? And there's this famous poem by Rudyard Kipling known as The White Man's Burden, which you can take a look at in your own time. So otherwise, there's just the general competition with other countries, right? The competition really can help to drive this imperialism. Who can do it better? Who can get the most out of it, etc. So there is some vocabulary that you should really know going into this unit. For starters, this whole idea of isolationism, which is where the United States kind of stood prior to this period. They're having little to do with other political affairs of other countries. You're going to have the idea of expansionism, with these countries trying to extend their national boundaries. Imperialism in general, right, which is a policy of powerful countries seeking to control the economic and political affairs of weaker countries or regions. And then the word annex, which simply means to more or less take control of. As you should remember from our Western expansion unit, the United States now has fully expanded to the Pacific Ocean, right? So there really isn't much of a place left for them to expand except continuing into the Pacific. We know that there are a bunch of small islands in the middle of the Pacific that can be very beneficial for places for trade, also military operations and coal resupply for ships that are going to be steaming back and forth across from the Pacific, across from Asia to America. And these areas are going to become invaluable for the countries that are able to control them. While this is not actually in the standard, I think it is relevant and important to talk about for a couple seconds here. One thing that we should talk about is Sewards Folly, right, and the annexation of Midway Island as well in 1867. So really, the push to dominate into the Pacific and Pacific Basin is really going to begin a bit before this main imperialism phase is going to pick up in the late 1890s. But at the time, in 1867, Secretary of State William Seward is going to help push Congress Congress to annex Midway Island, which you can kind of see right there on the map of where it's located, amply named Midway Island because of its location. But in addition to that, Seward is also going to actually buy and purchase Alaska for the United States from Russia for a relatively cheap cost there, right? $7.2 million. And this is going to become known as Sewards Folly because many people are arguing why the heck would he do this, right? It was seen as more or less a wasteland. It was also referred to as Seward's Icebox. And we do know now Alaska is obviously going to prove very useful later on from the gold and farming and timber and all the oil and natural gas resources that exist in the state. Let's talk a little bit about the annexation of Hawaii, right? So the Americans had made contact in Hawaii in the early 1800s, and traders are really going to start to venture there, right? American sugar growers are going to follow, and then by the late 1890s, Hawaii is going to be closely connected all this time to the United States through the Americans that are living there, right? And you can see the increase in sugar cane production there from our data from the USDA down there at the bottom, and you can see a picture there of workers gathering all of this sugar cane. And that's going to be the predominant crop that's going to be brought from Hawaii. I think this map really shows why the Hawaiian Islands are so incredibly important in the Pacific, right? This is perfect location. There's this large group of islands. You can have a lot of things going on there at once, but it also just is perfectly situated for these major shipping routes and trade routes to go anywhere throughout the Pacific. Once again, I'm going to apologize because this slide is going to overcomplicate this compared to what the standard says, which really just says that Hawaii will be annexed by American businessmen, but I wanted to kind of give you a timeline of how this happens and in particular why, right? So in 1849, Hawaii is going to become a U.S. protectorate by virtue of a number of economic treaties. So when you get that, ultimately, you're going to get more and more business interests heading that way, right? And then by 1875, you're going to get passing of what's called the Reciprocity Treaty, which will now allow Hawaii and Hawaiian sugar interests to trade in the United States markets. And this is actually going to be in exchange for land for naval bases, which will actually lead to Pearl Harbor a bit later down the road, although they're going to acquire that land. So now you all of a sudden have an influx of Hawaiian sugar going into the American markets, which is going to hurt the people in America who are producing sugar, right? It's going to decrease the prices. So by 1890, you're going to have William McKinley, who is going to be advocating for a tariff. And what this tariff is going to do now is going to place a high protective tariff on these goods coming from elsewhere, right? And this is going to attempt to protect the United States market from this Hawaiian and other foreign competition. And this is going to really hurt the Hawaiian sugar industry all the way until the annexation in 1898, right? So now with the American businessmen not wanting to pay this tariff, and of course just a natural progression of things, American businessmen backed by the United States and United States Marines are going to lead an uprising against the Hawaiian government, the Queen Liliuokalani, and going to take control of the country. You're going to get a provisional government led by a man named Sanford Ballard Dole, who's going to proclaim the Republic of Hawaii in 1894, and then the United States will officially annex Hawaii in 1898. As we continue to head even farther west, all the way across the Pacific, there's one other key term that you should really be aware of, and that's the idea of this sphere of influence, which really just means a territorial area within which the political influence or the interests of one nation are held to be the most important. And I have this little picture here on the right that kind of gives you an idea, right? When you can have direct control over something, and then you get a little farther out, you're going to have indirect control. You might control the leaders of the country, and you try to manipulate them to do what you want, and then as you get a little farther out, you're going to have no control, right? So that's more or less how spheres of influence work. And despite all this new territory in the Pacific, the United States is still going to be late to this game in Asia in comparison to the other imperialistic nations, right? And there is going to be this fierce rivalry in China by the United States as well as the other European powers that are going in there, right? And China really was relatively weak at this point. They hadn't industrialized, and therefore they really weren't capable of defending themselves against these oppressing European and American powers, right? So America was ultimately eager to join in to try to carve up some bit of China that they are able to. Here is a quick view of a map that you can see where the European powers had ultimately carved up into in Asia. By the year 1889, the Secretary of State at the time, a man named John Hay, was seriously worried that the other imperialist nations are going to lock the United States out of China and Chinese trade, right? So what he is going to openly advocate for is something that he is going to refer to as the open door policy. And what this would entail is basically permitting any nation to trade in the spheres of influence of the other nations. And what he's then going to urge is that all the foreigners there actually obey Chinese law and observe fair competition practices. And this is actually going to be agreed upon by pretty much all of the imperialist nations. The way they see it is they could then, instead of carving it up individually, which they still do a little bit, they're able to actually benefit from all of the different areas of China. And that's a big deal, right? But this is going to help lead to what's known as the Boxer Rebellion, which hopefully you remember a bit about later on in your World II class. All of that is going to help lead us now to the Spanish-American War in 1898. And again, I'm going to have to apologize because this is going to go a bit in detail beyond the standard, but I enjoyed this story too much to not to do that. So anyway, so Cuba at the time was controlled by the Spanish, right? And the Cubans had been looking around and seeing the Latin American revolutions being successful, as well as the bastion of freedom to its north in America, and the Cuban population wanted something similar for themselves, so they are going to actually rebel. And the Spanish are not going to like that, and you're going to get yourself a bit of an insurgent war here, right? And as a means of trying to fight against this insurgent war, the Spanish are going to use some very harsh, draconian measures as a means of trying to stop it, right? You're going to get a gathering up of the Cuban people in the rural areas, right? They're going to gather them up and bring them into concentration camps, or other words, reconcentration camps, as a means of not allowing them to help the rebels. You're going to have a lot of violence as well, and burnings of plantations and things like that, right? So when you have America now only about 100 miles to the north, the American media is going to begin to push essentially a moral high ground, right? How can we, hypocritically, not basically protect these people? How can we not go in and support freedom? We're only 100 miles from our shore, right? So this media is going to really be a big role in deciding what's going to happen here. And ultimately, President McKinley is going to look to kind of try to ease the tensions between the Cubans who are rebelling and the Spanish, and he's going to send an American warship to Cuba known as the USS Maine. So we are actually going to see a bit of an ease in the tensions here until February 15th, 1898, when you are going to get an explosion that rocks the Havana harbor, and the United States Maine will explode, causing about 260 casualties. So to this day, we still honestly have no idea what happened here, right? So there's a couple of different possible explanations, and we're going to talk through them each briefly just because. But the first one that's going to be advocated by the United States media in what becomes known as this yellow journalism, this exaggeration of the facts to sell newspapers, which is going to help push America into the war, is the thought is the Spanish did it, right? The Spanish didn't want America there, they're saying, and ultimately they mine the harbor and it blows up the ship, okay? The other possibilities include the fact that the coal bunker was actually pretty close to the ammunition bunker in the ship, right? So it's possible that the coal spontaneously combusted, and the heat from that actually through the steel plate in the wall blew up the ammunition as well. And this was actually not completely uncommon in this type of ship. So it was possible that it was just a complete accident. And then you also have the possibility that it was the Cubans. It's possible that the Cuban rebels, they false flagged it in an attempt to get the United States to help their side. So we really still don't know what happened per se, but we know who it gets blamed on, and it's going to get blamed on the Spanish. So as we know, the U.S. public support is going to follow that yellow journalism, and the politicians are going to more or less feel trapped, and we are going to end up at war with Spain. But that's not to say that there weren't politicians that were looking to exploit this crisis as well, right? And ultimately, not much consideration for the other possibilities we just talked about was given, right? So we get the Spanish-American War, we get a declaration of war against Spain, right? And this is going to be a very quick war when it comes down to it, where America is going to actually surprise themselves and even the world, right? It's also going to become known in some circles as this splendid little war, right? And under Teddy Roosevelt, who was the Undersecretary of the Navy at the time that this war declaration was made, he is going to send out orders for the American fleet to go and attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. You are going to then get the Battle of Manila Bay, which is going to be a quick and one-sided defeat against of the Spanish, right? And the United States is going to take control of the Philippines, which similarly to Cuba had actually also been rebelling against Spain as well. And the United States will then annex the Philippines. Throughout the lead up of this war, as well as during the war itself, there is going to be this romantic view of the war prevalent in what can be called the hawks, the war hawks, the jingoists, the imperialists, and the United States will effectively assert what it feels as its rights to intervene in Cuba, right? And similarly to what happened in the Philippines, well, not quite as quick, but you will also have a quick, decisive battle and fights in Cuba, right? There will be very few actual major confrontations of this war. Teddy Roosevelt will have resigned his post as the Undersecretary of the Navy. He's going to create a volunteer cavalry unit known as the Rough Riders, and he will lead a major battle of San Juan Hill, which is really one of the only big major engagements, and they're going to take this hill right from the Spanish. And throughout the whole course of the war, there will only be a few hundred American soldiers that have died as a result of the combat itself. And really just a few thousand will have died from the tropical diseases such as yellow fever, right? So for these people who have this romantic view of war, right, the people that have been pushing for American imperialism and American expansionism, this is the perfect case for it, right? They fight this war against what is considered a global power at this point in Spain, and they wipe the floor with it, right? And they are able to take control of Spanish assets such as the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Guam, right? And it just shows to them how useful this imperialism thing actually is, and the benefits to it without any of the major cons to it, right? Just to say a little bit more about the Philippines, when the United States takes control of the Philippines after the Battle of Manila Bay, which we just talked about, what's going to happen is that the Philippines at first are thankful for the United States for coming in and freeing them from their Spanish oppressors, but the problem is that the United States does not want to give them their independence. So when they come in, the United States is just looking to basically put themselves in charge, and the Filipinos who wanted their own independence aren't going to like this too much, so the Filipinos are going to rebel in much the same manner that they were when the Spanish were in charge. So the United States is now going to find themselves in a situation where they need to suppress the rebellion in the Philippines, right? And that is where things kind of come full circle here a little bit for the United States, because they are going to find themselves doing many of the same things that they felt were immoral in Cuba and in particular in the Philippines, as a means of suppressing this rebellion, right? So this is one of those marks on American history a little bit of how the United States actually treats the Filipinos and the Philippines here after the Spanish-American War. This map does a really good job at showing all of the new acquisitions and annexations by the United States between 1857 and 1904, when the United States will officially take control in the Panama Canal zone. So you can see, why all of these are particularly important. They're all, stopping points along the way across the Pacific Ocean, and they act as good bases and trading depots, essentially, for the Americans and other countries on their way. So now let's talk a little bit about Teddy Roosevelt, who was a war hero from the Spanish-American War. He had commanded the Rough Riders in Cuba, and this is where he's going to gain national fame. He will be chosen as the vice presidential candidate with William McKinley, and when they win, he becomes the vice president, and William McKinley will be ultimately assassinated in 1901. So when William McKinley is assassinated, Teddy Roosevelt will become president, and one of the things that Teddy Roosevelt does that kind of fits into this imperialistic mindset is setting forward in motion the building of the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal was initially going to be conceived by the French, and the French even begin the process a little bit, but they are going to quickly stop those efforts, and the United States is going to be the one that finishes the job here, right? So the Isthmus of Panama is, as you can see on that green spot on the map, where Central America becomes very thin, where it meets South America, right? And an isthmus is a narrow strip of land connecting two larger land masses with bodies of water on either side, right? And a canal is essentially digging a route through this narrow strip of land, right? And the reason why this is so important is that it's going to actually shorten the journey between New York and the West Coast, really the East Coast and the West Coast, by thousands of miles, right? And that's a really big deal. So what the United States does is they offer a $10 million cash plus $250,000 a year to Colombia, who actually owned Panama at the time, as a means of basically taking control of a particular part of Panama to be able to build this canal. And this is where you are going to get what is known as the big stick policy of Teddy Roosevelt, right? He is famous for this quote, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far." So when Colombia comes back and says they're not willing to take these terms that the United States laid out, Roosevelt is angered by this, and in fact, he is going to actually back a coup by the Panamanians that have been looking to break away from Colombia. So when he backs this and the coup is successful, Roosevelt will immediately recognize Panama and then make them the same offer that they had made the Colombians, and the Panamanians are going to accept this, right? And then both sides negotiate the treaty to build the canal, and they are going to be successful. It's a huge work project that's going to be very, very difficult to pay off, but when it is done, the fruits of it are still seen, obviously, today. There is a bit more about this imperialism, and the idea, right, is this whole idea of dollar diplomacy. So after Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, he's going to be succeeded by a man named William Taft, right? And there's going to be a bit of a new foreign policy here. They were essentially going to substitute dollars for bullets with this dollar diplomacy, and the thought becomes that Taft is willing to intervene in particular areas of the world if U.S. business interests feel threatened by unrest. Big places like this would be in Central America and South America, and even in the Caribbean, right? So he believed that American business interests would stabilize these troubled areas of the world, and ultimately, if they went in and the business interests, were successful, it's going to also profit the United States, right? So you're going to have an increase in investments in Latin America and in these Pacific Island nations, where you're going to be getting roads being built and railroads and harbors, which is going to stimulate the trade in these particular areas and bring profits, right? The thought is the money will help, but obviously it's America, again, exerting its influence on these areas that aren't necessarily able to say no. With anti-imperialists having a say and effectively kind of a pullback from some of those imperialistic policies as a result of things that are happening around the world, the United States is going to kind of begin to adopt a bit of an isolationist policy in the very beginning of the 1900s, leading up until World War I and their involvement in World War I. So what's going to happen is now you're going to have Europe go into war in 1914 for many different reasons that you should have talked about in your World II class, right? When Germany and Austria-Hungary are going to go to war with France, England and Russia in particular, right? We have the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who you can see there in the newspaper clipping and on the bottom right, with his wife by a man named Gavrilo Princip, who is up there on the top left. And then you're going to have all of the underlying factors that are going to lead to war, right? Think of the word main, right? Militarism, the alliance system that you can see the alliance breakdown right there, the imperialism and the tensions and the competition right there, and then also nationalism, this kind of overwhelming pride in their country, especially in some of these newly created and unified nation states such as Germany and Italy. Just as a quick breakdown of how things shake out with the alliance system, you're going to have the Allies, or the Triple Entente, which is Great Britain, France, and Russia, mixed with other allies as well, Italy, Romania, Serbia, and Greece, in particular fighting against the Central Powers, which are Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire in particularly, but you also have some other factors in there as well, right? This is a world war, so you're going to also have these guys pulling in resources and troops from their colonies that they had achieved during their colonization phase. For a number of reasons, for the very beginning number of years, 3 years really, for this war, President Woodrow Wilson is going to look to remain neutral with America, right? And there was a strong sentiment, because of the things we kind of just talked about, for America to not get involved in a European war, right? It's more or less seen as none of our business. Why would we put these things out there? Why would we send our troops to die? Why would we waste our resources and money on this war is the thought, right? And you can see some political cartoons down there and on the bottom and on the right there as far as different mindsets toward this neutrality. As time goes on, you are going to have the decision to enter the war becoming a large part because of continuing German submarine warfare, right? This unrestricted submarine warfare that violates the freedom of the seas and America also being close to Great Britain, right? So when the Lusitania is sunk by a German U-boat, obviously people in America are not going to be particularly happy because there are Americans on board. Remember, the Germans, sunk this ship because they said that the Americans and the British were transporting supplies and munitions and things over to the Allied effort. The British and the Americans basically said that we weren't doing that, but we know today that they were in fact. So the Germans sink this ship, but obviously in America they are going to be very angry about that, especially the deaths of the Americans on board. With Germany not wanting to get America into the war this early, they are going to pull back on that unrestricted submarine warfare for a bit, but as the war continues to rage on in Europe for a while longer, Germany is looking for any potential way to end this war, right? And the potential way to kick out Great Britain was frustrations over this unrestricted submarine warfare, so they are going to begin this in full scale in 1917. And on top of that, you are also going to get the Zimmermann telegram, right? Which was a proposal by Germany to Mexico that if the United States was looking like they were going to get involved and Mexico effectively stalled and attacked the United States, that once Germany and the Central Powers finished off the European powers over there, they would come over and help Mexico reclaim the territories that they had lost in the Mexican-American War. So this is a big proposal, and it gets intercepted, and the Americans find out about it, and this is going to, again, frustrate the Americans even more, and it's going to be another one of the underlying factors and events and reasons why the United States will get involved. Another big issue and reason why the United States is actually going to get involved in this war is summed up really by Woodrow Wilson in his speech to Congress on the declaration of war, right? And I'm going to read it here quickly to you with the big bold there, right? So, we are glad now that we see the facts with no veil of false pretense about them, speaking about the unrestricted submarine warfare, to fight thus for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its peoples, the German peoples included, for the rights of nations great and small, and the privilege of men everywhere to choose their way of life and of obedience. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and freedom of nations can make them. The big takeaway from this being that Woodrow Wilson in the United States was looking to make the world a safer place for countries that wanted to just rule them in their own ways, especially for democratic nations and countries in Europe. So with America in the war now, one thing we can definitively say is that the American military and presence going into World War I is really going to help tip the balance of the war and lead to the Germany's defeat in 1918, even though America's role here is going to be significantly smaller than what the French and the British and them have had to face up through this point especially. But, you know, America is going to essentially be that straw that breaks the camel's back here, getting fresh troops and fresh supplies and things into the war, and that injection into the Allies' side is really going to be the nail in the coffin for the Germans, essentially. So with the war wrapping up and coming to a close, the United States President Woodrow Wilson wanted to have a say in the post-war world, and he is going to develop what is known as the 14 points. And Wilson's plan is essentially trying to eliminate the causes of war. So while there are 14, we're really only going to go over 4 of these real quickly here as the key points that you should really take away from this, right? So one of the big ones is this whole idea of self-determination for the defeated nations, and really every nation here, that they are going to get to decide how they are going to govern themselves, and that they will not feel punished by the outcome, essentially, or super punished anyway. So additionally, the freedom of the seas is something that is extremely important in Wilson's mind, and that needs to be maintained. Additionally, Wilson advocates for the creation of what is known as the League of Nations, which is essentially the precursor to the modern United Nations that's formed after World War II, right? A place where all of these different countries can come together and diplomatically speak out against or for, and make arguments for war or peace, or just having diplomatic relationships in general, right? And then lastly, the mandate system, which again you hopefully learned about in your World II class, which will essentially help carve up the Middle East and things like that. So even with those 14 points, the European powers aren't essentially going to follow them, right? I mean, the French and the British in particular were the ones that had taken the brunt of this war for the Allies in particular, right? And they are going to insist on very punitive measures against Germany, right? There will be a League of Nations created, but those punitive measures, things like reparations and the redrawing of national boundaries and limitations on military and things like that, are ultimately going to lead to many of the conditions and economic factors that we know lead in the interwar period to the rise of people like Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. So here we are at the end. You're going to have a bit of debate in the United States as far as ratification, accepting the Treaty of Versailles, and also whether or not to join the League of Nations, which the United States is not going to do either of these. And that's going to be mostly the result of objections to the United States' foreign policy decisions, which had been made by the international community and organizations, and not necessarily by U.S. leaders. But you are also going to have a bit of a squabble here between Woodrow Wilson and the Senate, and as a result, the Senate is also going to not approve of the Treaty of Versailles here in the United States. You can see in this cartoon here, this gap in the middle of the bridge. You have all of these countries coming together to build this League of Nations bridge, which was actually designed, as we said, by the United States President Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points, but the United States, being the keystone to bring it all together, refused to join, and that's why the bridge is still missing the middle piece there. And that is where we leave it. So until next time.